Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you, Senator Moody, for initiating this vital and important discussion tonight. Over the past few weeks, we have witnessed the realities of decades and centuries of racist privilege being challenged anew. And as Senator Beam just reminded us, we have also clearly heard from our colleagues in the Parliamentary Black Caucus that extensive reports and serious proposals already exist. What is needed is the implementation of these proposals and the dedication of adequate financial resources to do so effectively. I rise today in support of that message and the extraordinary leadership, courage, and conviction of the Parliamentary Black Caucus, as well as the Indigenous Senators Working Group. It is vital that this place answer their calls, not only in the work that we do, but also in the way that we work. Colleagues, we have a responsibility to examine our roles and complicity as parliamentarians in perpetuating the systemic racism that has inspired the current global anti-racism movement. The discriminatory attitudes that demonstrators around the world are demanding be redressed provide the macro level of the micro examples of what happens every day, including in this place and in the other place, to those who dare to challenge the status quo, particularly when it comes to race. Given the historical roots and objectives of most of our state institutions, none of us should be shocked by the fact that racist or misogynist discrimination is manifesting on our streets as well as by police and all arms of the state. As senators in this chamber of sober second thought, we have a responsibility to represent the interests of those who are too often ignored and, worse yet, silenced. For centuries, that has been the reality endured by those who are racialized, particularly Black and Indigenous peoples. This information is well documented. We do not need more inquiries or investigations or commissions to tell us what we need to do. We could start with pulling out Senator Sinclair's Manitoba Justice Inquiry and reviewing the recommendations he made 30 years ago. We could also look at the recommendations made by the Law Commission of Canada and the OPP when Senator Boniface was involved in examining policing and other criminal legal issues. We could reflect on former Senator Kirby and his colleagues' observations of the injustices that result when armed police are expected to respond to mental health crises. Further, we could follow the sage advice of Senator Bernard in her lifelong journey to ensure anti-Black racism is exposed and extinguished. In short, we could look to the work of many, most especially our racialized colleagues in this chamber and outside, who have been drawing attention to these issues for many years. Most recently, the TRC, the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women Inquiry, the calls to action and calls for justice, respectively, provide us with some very clear direction, as does the statement released this week by the Parliamentary Black Caucus. We must ask ourselves how and why we are in this situation today, given all of this rich and thoughtful work. The answer is very simple, my friends. Too many of those who have resources, power, and privilege are loath to relinquish them. We must address the growing and unacceptable levels of economic, racial, and gender equality in this country. We must immediately act to rectify the situation in which we find ourselves. So where do we start? I do not know what the answer is for each of you, but for me it means to start with a few things. First, it means refusing to allow any legislation or study to leave this place if they perpetuate colonial vestiges of race, class, and gender bias. Well before my appointment, and most especially since, I've reflected on the enormous privileges and corresponding responsibilities that each of us have in this place. We must listen to, walk with, and see justice done for those denied voice within majority rules political systems. We must hold to account those who wield authority and power over others. As senators, our work is to ensure the substantive equality that the Constitution guarantees to every individual in this country. We must ensure that is a reality. Second, it means refusing to allow ourselves or each other to hide behind the archaic, elitist, colonial cloak of parliamentary privilege, which sometimes serves to protect those who harass and not those who are victimized, and prevents those targeted by the abuse from receiving any form of justice. This is an institutional problem, and it is time that we are able to discuss it frankly among colleagues, make clear what is unacceptable in an institution that represents Canadians, and move forward together. I thank our colleagues who, through their work in the Chamber and on various committees, are acting to illuminate and remedy these wrongs. Third, it means following the lead of our colleagues with lived experience of racism as they chart a course for our action. The calls of the Parliamentary Black Caucus to end systemic racism include the elimination of mandatory minimum penalties and revisiting restrictions on conditional sentences. They echo calls to Action 32 of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and Call for Justice 5.14 of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women. These are both measures that the government has committed to implementing. These and so many other studies, commissions, and reports have established clear links between the trauma and marginalization that are the legacy of racist and colonial policies and the current overrepresentation of Black and Indigenous peoples as victims, accused, and prisoners. This February, I introduced Bill S-208 based on a previous bill sponsored by former Justice Minister Irwin Cotler. Bill S-208 would provide judges the discretion to depart from mandatory minimum penalties in appropriate situations. It would allow judges to meet their obligation to craft fit and fair sentences based on the circumstances and context of each individual, including their Indigenous history or history as a member of a Black or other racialized community, and to consider community-based alternatives to incarceration. When Nelson Mandela came into power in South Africa, one of his first actions was to free all women with children under the age of 12 from prison. He recognized that to incarcerate mothers was to condemn future generations to oppression. In Canada, 8 in 10 women in prison are there as a result of their attempts to negotiate poverty and ensure the economic survival of their families. More than half are racialized. 2/3 of women in federal prisons are mothers with primary care responsibilities for their children. Their incarceration perpetuates decades of policies of forced separation, particularly of racialized children from their parents, the state-sanctioned removal of children, and discriminatory child welfare policies. For those who have been held accountable, served their sentences, and are working hard to integrate and contribute to their families and communities, criminal records too often perpetuate marginalization, stigma, and poverty. They bar access to jobs, education, and volunteer opportunities, and even housing, all of which are vital to moving on from criminalization and to creating safer and more just communities. Bill S-214 proposes to remove barriers to criminal record relief, including costs of upwards of $645 to $1,000 and punishingly complex application processes. Colleagues, after decades of study, we know what to do. We know the consequences of inaction. Time's up for empty platitudes and platitudinous responses and vacuous exculpatory justifications. Data from Toronto and Montreal, 2 of the hardest hit cities in Canada, reveal higher rates of COVID-19 in lower income neighborhoods. It is no accident. Rather, it is part of the product of systemic racism that these are also predominantly racialized communities with a majority of Black residents. Many of the residents also have no jobs or occupy precarious employment with poor working conditions and inadequate, if any, benefits. The realities reflected in this data should not be surprising. We know that racialized individuals face barriers to accessing higher education in Canada. We know that higher education is often needed for jobs that are outside of the gig economy. We know that women, and particularly racialized women, are overrepresented in the gig and other frontline and essential services and are central to the working of the economy. This is an economy characterized by jobs that are often unsafe, poorly paid, that have poor benefits and zero bargaining power. Further, we have long known that racialized candidates face racism before even being selected for an interview, and if they get an interview or a job, in those processes as well. For these reasons and more, it was predictable that those most profoundly affected by COVID-19 are racialized, poor women, and those living on the margins because of past trauma, homelessness, and institutionalization. As I see it, our job is to ensure that now and during the highly anticipated second wave of COVID-19 and beyond, we use our immense power, privilege, and influence to prevent the deaths of Black and Indigenous peoples, seniors, those with disabilities, those who are institutionalized, and those struggling to survive the crippling shackles of poverty. Honourable colleagues, a guaranteed livable income, along with other social and health supports such as childcare, education, pharma, mental, and dental health care, could help us protect all Canadians, not just the ones who look or live like us. Such a policy would ensure that those who are working in precarious employment and are dreaming of going back to school could afford it. Those who are targeted with racism and sexism in the workplace could afford to step away from that environment and find another job. Finally, such a policy could ensure that those who need to look after others, whether children, those with disabilities, or the elderly, could afford to do so, especially during times of crisis. It would level out the playing field and give everyone a fighting chance. And more importantly, it would give people choices. Colleagues, history is being made outside these doors, and we can choose to either listen, learn, and fight against racism, or continue to uphold the archaic status quo. I, for one, want us to be on the right side of history, and I believe you do too. For that to happen, we have a lot of work to do. We need to use our resources and influence to radically shift how we operate. To echo the words of our colleagues and friends, it is not enough to be not racist, we must be anti-racist. And for this, we must include voices in the Senate that are too often silenced by our society. These are the ideas, strategies, and vision that will bring us forward into this new era. Only then can we begin to operate as a body that truly represents and operates on behalf of all Canadians. I look forward to working with all of you and to continuing to learn from all of you. Miigwech, merci, thank you.